What's up, everyone? Welcome to a Friday episode of the Call Sheet Daily Podcast here at the Fans First Sports Network. I'm your host, Kevin Smith, and today we are doing our NFL Week 1 preview show. We usually do the hot route with Pez on Fridays, but man, my poor man Pez, he's teaching right now. He's got to teach. And Ocean City High School, we had a football game late into the night on Thursday night, so Pez and I didn't get a chance to record. He'll be back next week for our Hot Route show. I'm going to do the show today solo and preview the upcoming slate of games this weekend and also talk a little bit about last night's contest. Very interesting and odd game in Philadelphia last night. But the theme of today's show will be defense. Defense in Week 1. Much like we saw with college football last weekend in these high-profile matchups involving top 10, top 20 teams. The defenses were way ahead of the offenses in terms of their execution, their scheme, their speed. And I think something similar is going to be true in the NFL this weekend. We actually saw a little bit of it last night in the Dallas-Philly game. So let's just start there. I mean, what a bizarre contest that begins with Eagles star defensive tackle Jalen Carter being ejected before a single offensive play has been run for spitting on Dak Prescott. I got a text message from a former guy coached in the NFL, now working in scouting. And his text said very simply, there's a reason why talented players sometimes fall in the draft. And what he was alluding to was the fact that Jalen Carter, who could have been, from a pure talent perspective, the number 1 overall pick in the draft, slid down the board a little bit because there were teams that had some questions about his character, his maturity, etc. And you saw a little bit of that. He apologized afterwards, said that he was wrong, that he lost his head. I mean, you could see he and Dak Prescott had a little encounter as Dak Prescott kind of peeked through the Dallas huddle prior to running that first play. And Prescott, as cameras showed later, clearly spit in Jalen Carter's direction. He didn't spit on him. You may argue he spit at him, or at least in his direction. Was it intentional? Did it have a purpose behind it? Was he trying to provoke Jalen Carter? Well, whatever he was trying to do, it worked. Because Jalen Carter got into his face, spits on him, there's a ref right there, throws the flag, ejects him. So now the Eagles are down Jalen Carter. And yet, it still ended up a 24-20 game. If you were betting the over-under, and you bet the under, you won. The over-under, depending on what sports book you had, was somewhere in the neighborhood of 48 and a half points. And you're at 44. And I thought the defenses were much faster and more aggressive than the offenses, particularly after the lightning delay in the third quarter. That lightning delay, I think, allowed for both defensive units to kind of go back in and look at the film and make some assessments as to what the offenses were doing and then adjust. When Dallas got back on the field defensively, they aggressively blitzed Jalen Hurts. They sent on back-to-back plays corner blitzes. And Jalen Hurts actually escaped the pocket both times, but had to end up running and was unable to convert a first down. Dallas got him off the field. But I think that the aggressiveness with which the defenses were playing was an indication of two things. One, it's a mindset. You feel like, right, what are we going to sit back in coverage here and potentially allow a quarterback to pick us apart, or are we going to be aggressive and force them to beat us with pressure in their face? And obviously the defenses were opting for that tactic. But the other thing is, offenses just take longer to get in sync than defenses. It just takes more reps. The offenses are generally behind defenses early in the season. And I think we saw the effects of that. Philly's vaunted run game, other than Jalen Hurts getting out and doing Jalen Hurts things, struggled a little bit. I mean, they were not a dominant run game. And then Landon Dickerson goes out of the game, and now they really suffered as a result of that. So I think that there is going to be a trend in week one where you will see the defenses excel. So let's talk about a couple games that are on tap in which you can kind of expect, if you're a bettor, it may be good to lean in on the under here. And we'll start with tonight's game, Kansas City against the LA Chargers down in Brazil. The Chiefs have won 7 straight games against the Chargers. So you would think, okay, well, they're dominating this rivalry right now. But while that is true from a wins and loss perspective, look at those games. 6 out of those 7 games have been decided by 6 points or less. And in the last 3 games between these two teams, here are the total points scored. All 3 of these have been Kansas City wins, but here are the total points. These are not the points scored by the winning team. These are the points scored by both teams combined. 25, 27, and 36. That's the total points in Kansas City, LA Chargers. The Chiefs have won the last 3 games, 13-12, 17-10, and 19-17. They have been exceptionally close games, and they have been games where the defenses have been dominant. Tonight's game, the over-under is 46.5. If you are a bettor, this is a game that you should consider strongly leaning in on defense. Both the Chargers and the Chiefs have solid defenses. But now think about the circumstances. You have to go down to Brazil. You have to change all of your habits, which again, for offenses, I think things like timing and consistency and rhythm matter more. Last year down there in Brazil, the turf was sloppy and it was a higher scoring game, but it was a Philadelphia Green Bay game where you had 2 high powered offenses. The Chiefs have not been in the last couple seasons a high powered offense. They've been a good offense, no doubt about it. They've been a good offense. Any offense with Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce and Andy Reid directing them is a good offense. But their calling card the last 2 seasons has not been their explosiveness on offense. And we know that the Chargers, that Jesse Minter defense, is going to be prepared. And so look for this to be I'm not going to say a low scoring game, but with an over under of 46.5, you can see something similar to the Philly game. 24-20 in that neighborhood. It'll be tight. These teams know each other particularly well. And that's another thing that's going to drive the unders, most likely, in a lot of these week 1 games. Last year, if we go back to 2024, in week 1, the average over-under of the 16 games that were played was 45.5. So if you just do a median over-under for the 16 games in week 1 last year, 45.5, and the over hit in 10 of 16 of those games. But there were only 3 division games last year, and in 2 of those 3, the total points went under. Division games, the opponents are just more familiar with one another. They tend to be lower scoring affairs. As you saw Dallas Philly last night, 24-20, the under hits. Well, this year there are seven division games in week 1. And again, I think that's going to drive the under in a lot of these games. Defenses will be ahead of the offenses. All right, what are some other games in which I think you're going to see the defense carry the day? How about Houston and the Rams? That's a really interesting matchup. I think from just a matchup perspective, that's the most interesting game in week 1. Because you've got 2 teams that don't really have a history. I mean, Houston and the Rams have only played a handful of times. I think it's 4 times in their history. Simply because of the Texans being a fairly new franchise. They're only about 30 years old. And the crossover with these teams, it only happens once every 4 years. Houston's not even 30 years old. They're younger than that. both of these teams have stellar defensive fronts. You look at the guys up front, the Rams, guys like Jared Verse, Braden Fisk, Poona Ford. These are good football players who can get after the passer. And Houston allowed 54 sacks last year. 54, most in the league. And they haven't exactly, really bolstered their offensive line. Their best lineman from last year, Laramie Tunsil, is now playing in Washington. It's a bunch of guys that you haven't heard of on the offensive line. The one name you would know in Houston is Laken Tomlinson, the one offensive lineman you would know. And he's 33 years old, and he doesn't have a great pass grade. So Houston is going to have to do their absolute best to try to keep C.J. Stroud upright. And if they can, then Houston could score some points, because I don't think the Rams secondary is great. But will he even have that opportunity to push the ball down the field? And now when you flip it over, here's a Houston defensive front led by Will Anderson, Danielle Hunter, Sheldon Rankins. I mean, those guys can get after the passer as well. And they have a much better secondary than do the Rams, led by Darryl Stingley Jr., Kamari Lassiter. I mean, they've got some dudes in the secondary who can cover. And remember, Matthew Stafford, the Rams quarterback, has been dealing with a disc injury in his lower back all summer long. There was a lot of concern as to whether or not he'd even be able to go in week 1. He is not going to be exceptionally mobile. A 37-year-old quarterback with a lower back injury, particularly disc related, who hasn't played football in 7-8 months, that's concerning. Against a Houston front that can get after it as well as anybody in the NFL. The over-under in this game, 44.5. It just feels as though the offenses are really going to struggle to put up points. And in a game where the two teams don't have a lot of history, I think sometimes that favors the defense. Here's another one where I think the defenses will be out ahead of the offenses. Las Vegas against New England. That's another interesting matchup. The Raiders going across the country to play the Patriots. There are some exciting rookie pieces in this game. New England has an explosive back in Travion Henderson, the rookie out of Ohio State. Vegas has a between the tackles pounder in Ashton Jeanty out of Boise. But these are both run-first offenses. They're going to want to run the football and establish the run. Pete Carroll and Chip Kelly have spent the offseason bolstering the offensive line. They've got a couple good tight ends. They're going to be a 12 tight end or a 12 personnel team, 2 tight ends. They're going to want to run the football, control clock, minimize, use the play action game with Geno Smith when you can. But this is not going to be a wide open affair. And I think New England under Mike Vrabel will lean into the formula that Vrabel had some success with in Tennessee by running a ball control offense as well. This game has an over-under of 44.5 and is another one that feels like it will be a defensive slugfest. And one more in a similar vein. Pittsburgh and the Jets. And I don't know if this will be a defensive slugfest because the defenses are better than the offenses in both instances, which they are, or because both offenses are going to stink, which they might. I think Pittsburgh's offense will take a while to come together because they have a lot of new pieces there, starting with the 41-year-old quarterback who didn't play a down in the preseason. Aaron Rodgers will be what in week 1? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. That is the million-dollar question because the Pittsburgh Steelers have built a really interesting roster, a very un-Pittsburgh Steeler-like roster when they went out and acquired some big-name veterans who they seem to be trying to jockey themselves into position to make a run, right? Can they make a run? The addition of, again, big-name guys, Jalen Ramsey, DK Metcalf, Jonnu Smith, Darius Slay. I mean, these are guys predominantly on the back ends of their careers who have been very good football players in the league, not typically players that the Steelers invest in. And Rodgers, who is in Pittsburgh for what seems like a one-year run, is kind of the ultimate example of that. What does he have left in the tank? I don't know if anybody knows. The Jets know him extremely well because he was there the last 2 seasons. They know his weaknesses. They know he finished last in the NFL last year in QBR against the blitz. Pittsburgh's young offensive line has some new pieces and in new places. I think the Jets will blitz the daylights out of Aaron Rodgers and make that line protect and make him beat them with his decision making and his arm. And on the other side of the ball, the Pittsburgh defense is going to be one of the best in the NFL. And they are up against a familiar foe in Justin Fields, who doesn't have a lot of weapons outside of Garrett Wilson at wide receiver. They're going to have to really lean on the run. I mean, Pittsburgh, after getting gashed for almost 300 rushing yards in the wild card playoffs last year by the Baltimore Ravens, spent their offseason rebuilding their defense to stop the run. And they seem well positioned to do so. And so points will be at a premium in that Pittsburgh Jets game. It has an over-under of 37.5. That's a low over-under. 2017, if it's a 22-17 game, you're right there at the over-under. And I think that that's probably the neighborhood for this contest. I mean, you can absolutely see in this game coming in around 20-17, 17-14, 19-16, something like that. So, the theme of week 1 in the NFL, because it's early and defenses tend to be ahead of offenses at this point in the season, because there are so many divisional games, 7 of them in week 1, where the teams are extremely familiar with one another, I think this is a great week to lean into the unders if you are a bettor or if you are looking for something to perhaps put your money in. Okay, so tonight, again, Chargers at Chiefs down in Brazil. It's a good matchup on the field. It'll be a fun matchup off the field as you watch the Brazilian crowd. They certainly know how to party, man, and they'll turn that thing into a party. And then obviously the big kickoff on Sunday with the first full weeks of games. So we're here, ladies and gentlemen. Best time of the year is here, and I hope everybody enjoys it as much as I'm going to enjoy it. All right, we will be back on Monday, right, for our recap show, right, of the weekend's games and the most interesting things that we saw over the weekend. And every Monday now, or I should say every Tuesday now, I'm also going to do a show where we pick out the most interesting things we saw on the field in the weekend's games and highlight that. So lots going on here at the Call Sheet Daily. If you get an opportunity, like us on Spotify, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Anything helps with the promotion of the network here at Fans First. We're growing. Pro Football Insiders is really taking off. And obviously, I'm having a blast doing this. So hope you all will continue to take this journey with me. Until Monday then, have a great weekend, everybody.